everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight and welcome in this first of our Spring Speaker Series, Artists Envisioning a Green New Deal. My name is Chantal Bilodeau. I am the Artistic Director of the Arctic Cycle. And today, in this first session, we're going to focus on what is a Green New Deal. I want to say hello to all of you who are with us in this Zoom webinar, but also to people who might be watching us live on Facebook. For those of you in the webinar, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say where you are coming from tonight. Also, if you need, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a button for live transcript. If you click on it, you will get a live transcript of what we're saying. This wouldn't be possible without the support of the Bradshaw Library and Educational Foundation. So thank you for making this event possible. And I want to acknowledge that the Arctic Cycle is located on the traditional lands of the Lenape people, and I want to pay my respect to them and other Indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, and to their elders who have lived here, who live here now, and who will live here in the future. And I extend my respect to all Indigenous people everywhere. Helping me out tonight is my colleague, Julia Levine. And Julia, if you want to come on screen, hello.
Hello, I'm Julia, artistic producer with the Arctic Cycle, and I'll be in the chat collecting questions for the Q&A later this evening.
And Julia will also be posting links that are relevant to some of the things that are mentioned. Thanks, Julia. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. We have tonight with us community organizer and activist Dave Bradshaw, who is here in New York. We also have public policy researcher Seth Klein, who is in Vancouver, and playwright Marcus Youssef, who is also in Vancouver. Hello to all three of you and welcome, and I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. To get us started, so we're talking about the Green New Deal, so I would love to hear what is the Green New Deal and what is your connection to it? Maybe Seth, if you want to go first.
Hi, well, I'm Seth, and I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people on the west coast of Canada. And I'm not going to tell you too much because it's in the play that we're going to be reading, but I'm a climate activist and campaigner here in Vancouver.
Thank you. Day?
Hi, what a question to start on. What is a Green New Deal? To me, a Green New Deal it's hope. I'm also a climate activist here in New York City. And I can get into the policy. I can get into why exactly it is the great hope. But in all, it is the only thing that I think reaches the scale of the crises that we're currently facing in all of their intersectionality. So it is hope in my mind.
Thanks. That's a great answer. And I'm sure we'll come back to that hope because it's a very important piece of it. Marcus?
Hey, yeah, Marcus Youssef. I also live on unceded Coast Salish territories in the east end of Vancouver, about 4 blocks from Seth, in fact. I'm the true layperson on this panel. I'm a playwright, not a climate activist. And so Green New Deal is something that I have relied on my activists and better informed friends to tell me about. It's also honestly, been one of those things that is on the list of stuff that I learned really intensely, or most dramatically, from AOC, as AOC became a hero in my psyche and my consciousness. And of course, it's not the only place I heard about it, but that was high on the list of things where I was really paying attention, in part because of the extraordinary job I feel like she was doing at communicating with 51-year-old dudes in Vancouver like me.
Thank you. So the reason we're talking about the Green New Deal today is because at the Arctic Cycle, we have this program that we run every 2 years called Climate Change Theater Action. Last one was in 2019. The next one is coming this year in 2021. And for each Climate Change Theater Action, we have a theme. And this year, the theme is Envisioning a Global Green New Deal. And just to give you a little bit of context, Climate Change Theater Action, we commissioned 50 playwrights from around the world, Marcus being one of them, to write a short play, 5 minutes long, about an aspect of climate change based on a prompt. Then we take this collection of plays, we make them available to whoever is interested in organizing an event in the fall, so it coincides with the United Nations COP meetings in their community. So it's a way to bring people together, to have conversations that are maybe not prompted by scientific information or even political or activist information, but that are more personal stories, and then to use these personal stories to then encourage people to take action. So Marcus, you and Seth, you wrote a play this year for this Climate Change Theater Action. Marcus, I wanted if you want to say a few words about it, and then if you too would read the play.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to explain a ton because, in fact, this sort of idea that I got and that I proposed to Seth, it was actually very much kind of what we're talking about here, which is like Seth is a climate policy expert and a climate policy, somebody who's thought about it a lot, and I am not. And that, in a way, was the sort of idea for what we're going to do. So a lot of the explanation is kind of embedded in the piece itself. I will say, however, I did promise Mr. Klein that I would tell everybody he's not an actor. He wanted me to share that. He's not an actor. However, he is playing himself. So, you know, I told him there was no way to do it wrong. Like, he's just playing himself. So, so I think that that's all we need for setup.
Okay, we'll go away for a few minutes and let you read the play. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, it's only about 5 minutes long, so nobody has to. Yeah, you don't have to dig in too deep there. Alrighty, you ready, Mr. Klein?
Let's do it.
Okay. We are walking
outside in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada,
unceded Coast Salish territory,
on a cold day in late January 2021 during the second wave of the COVID pandemic.
Thanks so much for doing this, Seth.
You're welcome. Hey, just before we start, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about your dad.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that.
You were close.
Yes. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we were. Yes.
Yeah. You've talked to me about him.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, he was a very powerful figure in my life, as dads are, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought we could just wander down towards Trout Lake because that's where I like to walk.
I'm happy with that.
Great. So beautiful today. Hey, so sunny. So I'm just going to dive in. Can you introduce yourself in whatever way you feel like you want to?
Okay. My name is Seth Klein. I am most recently the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. For 22 years before that, I was the founding director of the British Columbia chapter of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
And over the last few years, you've gotten kind of like laser focused on climate change as an issue.
Yeah, I'm very focused on the gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain, and figuring out how to tackle that gap.
Is that, in your view, is like that the Green New Deal?
I think the Green New Deal is a central and powerful model for bridging that gap. Yeah.
So what is the Green New Deal? Like, just give us like the one paragraph summary.
Okay. So like the original New Deal, the Green New Deal takes a profound crisis and meets it with massive public investment. It's an ambitious plan to spend billions in new green infrastructure to electrify everything and create millions of jobs. I'm not sure that was quite a paragraph.
No, it was a very good paragraph.
Thanks. Well, can I add, the Green New Deal is about linking climate mobilization to tackling inequality. What I learned in my research about the effort to mobilize Canada for World War II is that it was actually hard to do with typical propaganda, go across the sea and go get Hitler. That works, but only to a point. To truly mobilize people, the government had to promise that the society people came back to was going to look different, which happened. Canada saw its first major income support programs introduced in the war: unemployment insurance in 1940, the family allowance in 1944. The architecture for the entire post-war welfare state was written during the war. It was a pledge that the society people came back to was going to look different from the one that they left. That's how you mobilize everyone. And it's the same with the Green New Deal today.
What's the best argument against it?
Against it? What's the best argument against the Green New Deal?
Yeah, I mean, if say you had to choose one, what would it be?
That it's not realistic or feasible.
And what about that argument kind of keeps you up at night a little?
None of it.
Really?
No, really. I talk about in my book, we're all trapped by the legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism that has told us what is and isn't allowed or possible. The powerful thing about an emergency, whether it's the war or COVID, is that things that seemed politically or economically off limits suddenly become possible. If you said to Canadians in 1938, does the government have what it takes to completely transform the economy, as actually happened during the war? I'm pretty sure most of them would have said no. And it's going to happen with climate too. The only question is whether it's going to happen in time. And that's what keeps me up at night.
So I'm also conscious that people who may be watching this right now, watching what we're constructing, are not from wealthy industrialized countries. How does that impact what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a fair question. I guess the other piece of the legacy of neoliberalism is that it has undone our sense of our ability to do grand things together. And maybe it's wishful thinking, but history is full of surprises of how quickly we pivot if and when we recognize emergencies for what they are. And every society has to excavate from its history what those relevant examples are.
So when I pitched this to you, I said this year the theme is envisioning a Green New Deal. And you were like, so this year you're not going to write something so nihilistic.
Less dystopian, I think I said.
Right. Yeah, you said less dystopian.
Your last piece was very dystopian, Marcus.
It was.
So, I mean, there's a lot of artistic work happening now that tackles climate, but it's almost universally dystopian.
And what's your read on that?
I mean, it's understandable, right? When we think about climate, we imagine this terrifying hellscape that's likely to emerge if we fail to rise to this moment. But I'm struck that a lot of the artistic mobilization for the Second World War wasn't like that. Even though they were surrounded by death and destruction, it was positive. It was rallying the public.
I wonder if it's like artists not wanting to be propagandists.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, you can't tell artists what to do. I get that. I think the Green New Deal needs to have a big arts component, just like the original New Deal did. And in World War II, artists walked a careful line, right? They were forthright about the gravity of the crisis, and yet they still imparted hope. And I grabbed hold of the Canadian World War II story because I was trying to excavate a historic reminder of what we're capable of. And everyone's got different stories to draw on that invite us to say in moments of existential threat or crisis, who do we want to be?
Totally. Everybody goes through crisis in some way, right? I mean, it's part of the human experience.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to say again, I'm really sorry about your death.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Seth. I appreciate that. And scene. That's the little play. Y'all can come back now. Nice job, Seth.
Congratulations. See, if you hadn't said that you were not an actor, I would have totally believed it. You sounded wonderful as
He
you.
forced me.
Yeah. So I want to come back to you too about the play, but I would love to hear from Day. First of all, there was a lot that was said in the play that connects to your sense of the Green New Deal being hope. And I also wonder, how is it for you to hear information being conveyed in a different way like this?
Yeah, I think that last part in the play, talking about how artists impart hope in dark times. I'm a former actor. Theater has been a large part of my life for that exact purpose, and now I enact that purpose in a different way. And so seeing it come together like that was really exciting and super enjoyable for me, especially with something like the Green New Deal, which can often be seen as like so big and hard to understand, and explaining it through that lens and through art makes it accessible. So bravo.
And Seth, did you need a lot of convincing to be willing to contribute to a play?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you know, when Marcus asked me to do something, I just say yes. But you can see it's a bit of a challenge, right? It's a bit confusing because the brief to us was to do the Green New Deal. My book does talk a lot about the Green New Deal, but it is structured around the Second World War. So you see me jumping back and forth there. And that's because I was looking for this historic story to tell. And it's a Canadian book. And we didn't have an original New Deal like you had in the States. The war was our New Deal. And so you see, historically, it gets a bit mashed together, but I think it still works.
It does. It works for me, at least.
Yeah, speaking on behalf of the lay people, I'm like, it totally makes sense to me.
And Marcus, so there's reference in the play about the last play you wrote, which Seth says was dystopian or apocalyptic. I can't remember the word.
We called it dystopian, which it is. It was a piece of dystopia, for sure.
Yeah, and that play, actually, I want to say that play has been turned into film by New World Theatre, and that film is going to premiere at the Vancouver International Film Festival this coming Saturday. And Marcus and I will have another conversation this week for two people who haven't talked to each other, a lot. We're going to be talking to each other several times this week. And Julia is dropping the link in the chat for that event. But so I want to ask you how did you go from one to the other? What made you go from dystopian 2 years ago to this year?
Honestly, I mean, it's exactly what's in the little piece. It's that I remember when you asked me to write a one for this year's edition, what popped into my head was what Seth said about my piece being really dystopian, which it was.
Oh, sorry, man.
No, it's good. Like, it's good. And I went, right. And then I thought about, because Seth and I actually have been talking quite regularly over the last few years, and I read it. I was one of the readers on his book, which is a fantastic book, The Good War Book, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And I mean, obviously very Canadian specific, but I would say worth reading internationally as well from an international perspective. And I just thought, I feel like, I write a lot, and I read a lot of different things. And often, like, I feel this immediate pressure, like I got to think of something. And often I find that the thing actually is not to think of something, but actually to take a moment to breathe and go, well, what are the impulses around whatever the question is that are occurring for me? And that's what came up for me. And so I thought, well, I'll call Seth and see, like, and I didn't know what it would be, but I said, let's go for a walk and have a conversation about this idea, which you know a lot more about than I do. And I like these I write lots of different kinds of things, but I like these sort of like verbatim plays that are very simple. It's really just two people having a conversation. It's not much more than an interview with a tiny little story, which was just what was happening. So my dad had just died, and Seth was very sweet, kind about it, and as a way of kind of framing it, and that's it. Yeah. So it's really just responding to what occurred as I thought about it. Yeah.
It works beautifully, and of course, I'm sorry about your dad.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you mind my saying too today? It's thrilling to do this with Day as someone from Sunrise. Sunrise is in the book, even though it's a Canadian book, because just so you know, the climate movement in Canada has been watching Sunrise carefully, and it's very inspiring.
Thank you so much.
Day, I wanted to ask you about your work with Sunrise. I know that you've been part of, or you are part of Sunrise nationally, but also that the New York City Sunrise as a hub for Green New Deal for public housing, and a Green New Deal for public housing team. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely can. Thank you so much, Seth. I am a part of the national body, so I'm the Black constituency manager for Sunrise National. So Sunrise is an organization full of youth. So we think of youth as like under 35, and what we're doing is we are mobilizing for a Green New Deal. And what a lot of people don't know about a Green New Deal is that it is inherently intersectional. And in order for us to win one, we believe that we need a multiracial coalition, we need a cross-class coalition, and we need to really be mobilizing against systemic issues. Climate change isn't just going to be changed by us giving up the plastic straws and doing those little things. While those can be helpful, having a global movement, honestly, to make a serious change in the way that we do life is the answer, and that we believe that comes in the form of a Green New Deal. So I am a part of the national organization organizing specifically Black youth for the Green New Deal, because we all have very different experiences, and the experiences of the Black community and how those experiences should be intrinsically tied to the way that we build policy for the Green New Deal in a reparatory sense is what I do up top on the national body. And I also lead our Green New Deal for public housing policy push in New York. Yeah. So there are a whole bunch of different tiers, and I love being able to be here with two people from Canada doing the work over there. And we're doing the work over here. So on different levels.
Can I ask Day, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I just, again, as the layperson who feels pretty ignorant generally, like around these questions, I'm just curious if you're up for it, like just speaking just for a moment or two about how the work you do, like the Green New Deal intersects around public housing, like what the kind of focus of that work is.
Yes, that is my favorite question. That's my favorite thing to talk about ever. Okay. So in the United States, during the time of the New Deal was actually when public housing was first built here. And that was an amazing thing. It gave a bunch of people homes, but it was also just like a lot of the things in the New Deal. It was very racially problematic. It had very Jim Crow-esque policies. Black and brown people were not allowed to be in public housing. It was redlined to a degree once Black and brown people did get into it. And there are a lot of laws in the United States that make it almost impossible to even retrofit and update public housing, let alone build new public housing. There's actually an amendment called the Faircloth Amendment that completely stops any building of new public housing that is not a one-for-one replacement, which basically means if you're talking, okay, so in order to replace public housing, you have to knock down one and then rebuild it. And we can't do these two things at the same time because people who live here need somewhere to live. You have effectively shut down any possibility of building new public housing. And so whenever I get to this part in spiel, everyone's like, cool. What does that have to do with climate? Well, the fact of the matter is, because these buildings cannot be updated, and in the United States, a lot of our emissions come from residential buildings, and in New York City specifically, because we have enough public housing to fill a large city, not a small city, not a medium-sized city, a large city. Actually, most of the carbon emissions in the city are coming from public housing. So not only are people not getting not getting clean water half of the time, their heat doesn't work because it hasn't been updated since forever. And all of those things that make life tenable and like almost unlivable there. We are also, in not retrofitting public housing and in not building new public housing, not only contributing to the homelessness crisis in this country, but also killing the planet. So the Green New Deal for public housing, what it does is it brings together all of these different facets and says, okay, first of all, we need more public housing. We have a homelessness crisis here. Number two, that public housing needs to be retrofitted, number one, against the climate crisis that is already happening. In New York, we had Hurricane Sandy, and public housing residents, some of them didn't have power again for months because their buildings were not prepared for it. Some of their buildings were flooded so badly that they couldn't come back for months. So they need to be retrofitted against the climate crisis and against emergency weather, but also all of the appliances need to be replaced so that, number one, they work and people can live with dignity. And number two, so that they are not literally killing the city as we all live and breathe. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Seth, I wonder, I know you've written a lot about poverty in British Columbia. I wonder if that connects at all to the question of housing that they just brought up.
Yeah, it does. I mean, my background as a policy person wasn't originally in climate. It was in poverty, inequality, welfare policy, tax fairness, economic security. So I, like many, I mean, I come to the climate file, as it were, through the lens of social justice and equality. And you know, the book is trying to make the case that tackling the climate emergency has to go hand in hand with tackling inequality. And not just, you know, and I think it's important to say, like, there are all these climate policy purists out there who say, don't do that, you know, don't make this any more complicated. Climate's complicated enough. Don't weigh it down with all these social justice considerations. And I think they're wrong. And I think they're wrong, first of all, because these things are inherently connected. I mean, they already gave two concrete examples of that. But at a macro level, you know, the richer you are, the higher your emissions. And the poorer you are, whether as a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate and the more impacted you are by climate policies. And so they have to be linked. But the main argument that I'm making in the book, and I think this has an echo in the Green New Deal and the original New Deal, is that we have to link these things because that's how we win. When you are asking people to engage in a grand undertaking into the unknown, you can't ask them to park, you know, all of the other challenges and economic insecurity challenges that they face. You have to wed them together, and that's what I was getting at in the line in the play. When it came to the mobilization for World War II, when it was just about the war, and you know, so by the way, Canada was engaged in the war 2 years before the United States, the recruitment numbers were low, and what they realized a couple of years in is that if they were actually going to mobilize all of society, if they were actually going to hit those recruitment numbers, it had to be about what kind of society people would come back to. And so that's where, for me, these issues all come together, and it comes together around labor and just transition as well. And so this is where the Green New Deal does such a great job of packaging these things all together, right? And taking the whole jobs versus environment trope and just flipping it on its head and seizing the mantle of job creation in this very exciting way that, as Day said, is all about hope. And its timing could not be more propitious as we try to figure out what the recovery looks like post-pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Post-pandemic, that's a whole other. I want to ask, I think all three of you, and Marcus, I have something else for you if this is not a question you can answer, but what are reasons for hope? Like, what do you see where there's progress, where there's buy-in, where there's a, maybe you see some movement that has a chance of having a big impact?
I'm going to defer to you two to start. I might throw something in at the end, but I'm going to defer to you two to start.
What makes you excited?
I saw Seth go off mute, but I realized I'm the only person on mute. Yeah. So can you repeat the question? My brain got a little for a second.
Yeah. I'm wondering, so we've talked about a lot of things that need to happen, and I'm wondering, what do you see, where do you see movement? Where do you see reason for hope, like things that are happening in all this work that we need to do?
Yeah. Here in New York, we have passed like the New York version of a Green New Deal. It's called the CLCPA, and organizers on the ground, Sunrise and a bunch of other organizers, worked incredibly hard for over a year. And we used the methods that we have been using, which is not just being in political rooms and meeting with people, but harnessing the power of the people and an intersectional group of people in order to get things done. Also, the fact of the matter is, if you think back to even 2018, looking back like 4 or 5 years, we still had politicians saying that climate change didn't exist. It wasn't real. So therefore, how can you mobilize against or legislate something that isn't real? And now, even though we still have people who are like, it is not in my best interest to do anything about it, and so they politicize their way around it, no one is saying that. No one is saying that. And so I've seen how far that we've come in this fight, and having legislators who have won races based on like organizing, on having actual buy-in from the places and the people that they represent, and those politicians actively fighting for a Green New Deal in multiple different facets, all of the time. That is my hope. And of course, seeing more and more young organizers and older organizers every day coming out to support the Green New Deal and the idea and the spirit of a Green New Deal is everything.
When I'm asked this question about hope, and honestly, I'm not saying this just because Day is here, but I like Sunrise's movement is part of that. I think of that, and in particular, very concretely, like as an outside observer watching the U.S. elections, I marvel at the fact that when in the primaries, when Joe Biden first presented his climate plan, it wasn't very good, and by the end, it was pretty incredible. And I actually think Sunrise gets a lot of credit for that. Like it got transformed. I think, for us too in Canada, I like to try to remember that up to the moment of the pandemic and the first lockdown, momentum was really building. I mean, we had these global student strikes that were unlike anything we've seen. In our country, incredible solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en and other land defenders that I haven't seen in my lifetime. Like momentum was really building. And the challenge now is to recapture that. But as Day was referring to, I think we have witnessed a shift in the terrain of public opinion in the last 2 to 3 years, where in particular, climate emergency has moved from being a threat somewhere off in the distant future, in a distant place, to here, to now. People say they are experiencing it. And that has made things possible politically that weren't possible not very long ago. But the truth is, Chantal, this hope question always trips me up a little bit, because the honest answer is none of us who work on the climate issue, we all wrestle with despair. And we live in an ambiguous time where we do not know if we will achieve what we need to achieve in time. That said, going through this historic exercise of digging into the World War II story is a source of hope, right? I mean, you get this historic reminder of the speed and scale of how quickly we have transitioned before. Just to give you Americans one example, right? Pearl Harbor happens in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolls off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, their production and sale is basically illegal. I mean, that's speed and scale. And it's useful to have that reminder. But the other important reminder out of this, and it's to state the obvious in the rearview mirror of history, but I think we often forget it. All those millions of people who mobilized and enlisted, I mean, in Canada, out of a population of 11 million at the time, over 1 million people enlisted. I mean, that's a remarkable level of mobilization. But you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. And they did it anyway. That's where we're at today.
Thanks, Seth. I appreciate your comment about hope. It is a hard one. And I will use the word energy, what gives you energy or what gives you courage, because sometimes it's easier for people who work in the climate sector, it's easier to relate to, because yes, hope is hard to come by, definitely. But I have been encouraged. I feel like something happened during the pandemic where everybody was forced to take a step back and suddenly the important issues rose up to the surface. And I hope we can keep this momentum as we go forward. Marcus, I wanted to ask, since you come at this in a different way, what do you hope, so you've been through Climate Change Theater Action once, you know sort of what happens with the plays, and I'm wondering this time around, what do you hope people will take from the play? What do you hope they'll leave with? What do you hope the impact will be? Do you have an idea?
Well, I mean, I love the project because you explained it a little bit, but it's pretty extraordinary. Like these, and unusual in that these 50 plays are just distributed around the world for free. So anybody who wants to put on a community event can make them happen, and they happen in hundreds of universities and in high schools, in community groups, in climate justice groups. Like they happen in a very, very broad range of places in dozens of countries around the world. So that's a pretty extraordinary. So just being part of that feels important and meaningful to me. Just the model itself, which is so community-based and grassroots. I thought this piece would be of interest simply because, as I said to you, I remember, Chantal, when I proposed it, was just that to give some context. I hope that the piece, this idea of crisis and not knowing, as Day and Seth were talking about not knowing, like not having hope. I mean, this conversation utterly coincidentally happened to take place as I processed my father's death. I didn't know he was going to die. I didn't know what grief was going to look like and what that process is going to look like. Just as there are many things in this life that we don't know much about, and that it feels to me that coming present or attempting to come present and breathe through that mystery and that unknowing and not knowing is part of this work and part of the work of being human. And so I don't know, maybe that comes through somehow a little bit. That's I guess my personal interest.
Yeah, and we've got, of course, in the last year, we had a good exercise of living in the not knowing. Yeah, and what I appreciate about your play, so as you mentioned, a lot of universities participate and will put on some of these plays. So your play is, of course, a wonderful entry into this subject, right? Like people can do it first, it explains all the context, and then it helps understand whatever other play might be presented afterwards. So it's
that's kind of how I thought it might be useful, as a kind of primer or something.
Yeah. I want to see, maybe Julia, do we have questions in the chat that we should bring in now?
Not yet. Just made an offer in the chat if folks want to share questions. I will share that we do have a comment from Facebook about the need to tell solar punk stories, to put hope out there, to help fuel society to take action with the belief that they can make a difference.
I
Great.
don't know what
So,
solar punk is, but I look forward to finding out.
Seth, yeah.
Well, I mean, just if we're waiting for questions, I feel compelled because your audience is artists, to say, I think so. We're starting to see all of this artistic contribution on climate, which is exciting. Some of it's dystopian, some of it isn't. But I think we're only just starting to scratch the surface. And I think there is a role for artists to play, politically mobilizing as artists, not just producing the work, but knowing as we do that public funding on this incredible scale was actually a core piece of the original New Deal, right? Through the Works Progress Administration. We need that again. We need large scale public funding for artists to mobilize us for the climate emergency. And artists should be politically organizing, calling for that. I think artists, I mean, as I said in the play, you can't tell artists what to do, but you can provide funding and you can give a challenge. And my sense is that people respond to that. As I was writing, and particularly writing in the book about the role of arts in the war and now, it started to dawn on me that, World War II had a popular soundtrack. And so did the anti-Vietnam War movement, and so did the civil rights movement. But the climate emergency movement doesn't really. There's songs out there, don't get me wrong, but there isn't like a truly popular soundtrack. And I started to wonder, how did that happen? And as I was preparing for my book to come out, I started to put the word out to different musician friends, like, hey, write me a song. And I remember talking to one Canadian musician, a guy named Joel Plaskett, pretty popular guy here, and he was like, yeah, artists, I don't really work that way. I don't write that way. But and then just before my book came out, he sends me this email with a link. He's like, I wrote you a song, I don't know. We just need to issue the challenge for this non-dystopian music and art that will rally us, and then to seed the idea that this could actually be on a grand scale if our governments actually are prepared to fund it.
Dude, I wrote a play starring you.
You win, Marcus. Can you share the song, Seth?
Well, if I shared earlier in the chat the link to my book page, and if you go to it and scroll down, I have a little bit about arts and culture, and there's a link to Joel Plaskett's song. And there's also a poster there. The other thing I did in anticipation of the release is I put a little challenge out to students at a local art university here in Vancouver to riff off World War II posters and create climate emergency posters. The Green New Deal movement's done some of that too, and it's really great. And I think we've only just begun.
Should I keep going? Julia, do you have something?
Yeah,
okay.
The chat is a buzz now. Brief question that Marcus, Seth, maybe you could just respond to in the chat is Ruth asks if either of you are connected to the University of British Columbia. And then maybe others can, you all can respond vocally. Kimberly asks, are there examples of arts policies that you see are exciting for supporting and incentivizing sustainable artistic work?
I'll quickly, I did my master's in creative writing at UBC, and I'm sometimes an adjunct professor in the creative writing department there. That's my affiliation with UBC. Seth, do you have an affiliation with UBC?
I'm actually an adjunct at Vancouver's other university, Simon Fraser University.
Yeah, there we go. In terms of the climate, I'll speak from my perspective on the arts policy. I think we're in a really interesting moment. I'm somebody who, my work has been, I mean, this is pretty micro, but Chantal's been involved in this work. I think a big question right now for a lot of us is around, for those of us who are in live art and live performance, is about our own consumption and our own carbon footprints. Certainly I feel that. There's a lot of talk in our sector about how to do what we do and to enable the kind of human connection that is so central to what we do, but to do so responsibly. and to take ownership of some of the things that we're all trying to fight for. So Chantal actually with the National Arts Center facilitated a whole conference about this question. That's a talk that's really alive and feels very important, and something that's really central to my actual day-to-day life post-pandemic. It's an interesting one too. And this is a bit sideways, but we're also getting, in this moment, and it might seem good on the climate front, I'm not sure, but like there's a tremendous push in Canada at the federal level in terms of the kinds of funding that Seth talks about from the pandemic, to push us all online, to push even live performance artists online. Is all the money's being poured into that because it's innovation. And I don't know if I guess that's a good climate thing. It also worries me though, because the kinds of questions that we talked about in terms of grief, as Selena referred to in the chat, is in terms of what are the proximity of our human bodies to each other offer in terms of organizing, in terms of what they mean, in terms of the actual lives lived by actual people. I worry that we also risk losing the importance of that connection in the wake of the pandemic, given all the kind of surveillance capitalist kind of forces that want to push us into this space too. I don't know.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, I think we can, got a couple more questions, variations on the theme, but Clara is loving this talk and is wondering about Canada-US collaborations or collaborations across North America. And do the Canadians see Trudeau being open to learning and adjusting as Biden has been to the Sunrise Movement? And then I'll just tack on one more to that. Is personal action a part of Green New Deal thinking, or is that being replaced or complemented by systemic interventions?
Renee, I can comment on the second question, but the first one I will leave to Marcus and Seth.
We want you to talk about Trudeau. I want to know.
I have thoughts, but probably not one of you guys. As far as personal action, I think that the orientation of the Green New Deal is making those systemic interventions. One thing that I will say is that everyone shows up in their different ways in any movement. Everyone has their different skills, and if your first step is going, I am going to only use sustainable, reusable things. That is a-okay. I'm going to get a hybrid. Awesome. I think that the way that also makes you feel better, because climate anxiety is very, very real. We are all going through a collective trauma of a global pandemic, while constantly going through a collective trauma of like, am I going to be here in 10 years? Is this going to be here? What will I miss? And I saw someone mention the Jennifer Atkinson book about climate grief, and harnessing grief as an agent of transformation. And climate grief is very, very real. And so if you can do anything to make yourself feel better and make you feel like you are doing something that matters to help with this crisis, even if you can't get out to a protest, you can't support a bill and be calling representatives and doing all of that, or be creating a new retrofitted space, then I think that is 100% worth doing. I think that the orientation that I take is that those actions are incredible. However, I don't want us to continue taking the individual citizens, continue to take the brunt of blame and trying to change something that is a systemic issue. The way that our laws are set up, the way that these big corporations are set up, who have known about this crisis for decades and actively didn't know anything about it, means that even if we are all taking these actions, we are still not bringing down our emissions to a point of saving us. And so that's where I choose to put my energy. I still do the thing where like, I am not using a plastic water bottle. I'm sorry, it just gives me anxiety. It does. But I think that that is the best part of that, the way that it makes you feel like you are engaging. And I think that's always an amazing first step to engaging in doing the systemic stuff.
I mean, my thoughts on that are quite similar. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of things we should be doing personally to change how we get around and how we heat our homes. But in this moment, in this decade, which is all about speed and scale, this is inherently a political project. The thing about whether it's mobilization for war or for the climate emergency, it's an inherently collective enterprise. We only win this together. And I think part of what has been behind the lack of success of the traditional environmental movement for so many decades now is that so much of the solutions are individualized. It's all about individual consumption and behavior change. And not to completely diss that, but that's it. The movement lands there because that's the insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism, is to make it all about individuals. And when you ask, like, why aren't governments spending at the scale that they should? Why aren't they just using the regulatory power of the state to require change? Why aren't they creating new public institutions to just get the goddamn job done? It's because neoliberalism has told us none of those things are allowed anymore. And so we default to this individual frame of action. Hopefully, I think, you know, one of the legacies of the pandemic is that we're jolted out of that. And in some ways, our sense of imagination of what we can do on a larger scale is blown open a little bit. On the other question, just around Trudeau and Biden and so on, I mean, look, the US has, in the space of a few months, gone from being a laggard behind what Canada was doing to just catapulting right ahead. What's coming out of the new administration is miles ahead of where Trudeau is. And hopefully that will help us in Canada. And I do want to say one other thing, because Day alluded to the sort of COVID fatigue dynamic, which is also real. Because I've had people, you know, listen to my spiels and talks about the book and say, oh, you know, look how tired people are in the pandemic after less than a year. And now you're asking them to go into emergency mode for a few years. I mean, how realistic is that? And my response is there is an important difference, which is that the things we were called upon to do in the face of the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. Stay home, isolate. That's hard. The good news is that what we are called upon to do in response to the climate emergency is precisely the opposite. We're called upon to go out and do something grand together. And we can do that for a few years.
And boy, are we longing for that, to all get together again. We have only a few minutes left. So before I wrap up, I want to ask each of you if there's something going on coming up soon that we should look out for, that you're doing.
That we ourselves are involved in?
Yeah, something like, is there something that people can look up? You know, are you giving a talk? Is there a play coming up? Is there a day? Is there something that people can join in? If not, it's okay.
I mean, I'll plug my movie again.
Okay, yeah.
Premiering at the Vancouver International Film Festival online on Saturday at 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. Is my dystopian film Dust, which was originally commissioned for this project 2 years ago. So there's that.
Great. Seth, do you have something?
Well, I mean, I try to. It's funny. The book was the most artistic thing I've ever done, or creative thing. I've never, you know. Otherwise, I spent 22 years writing boring policy reports. And now that it's been out 7 months, but I'm still doing about 3 or 4 events with it a week. I try to list them on the website that I've shared, and I'm about to launch a new climate emergency unit that's going to just try to animate the ideas in the book.
Great, that's a big deal. Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Day?
If any of the people in the participants in this meeting or in the chat are based in the US, we would love to have you at Sunrise. You can join a local hub. They are literally everywhere. And if there's not one near you, there are always things going on. You can check the website, but moreover, find things in your local context and ways to engage. Everyone is different and has different skills, and all of those skills are needed in this fight.
Thank you. So we're just about at time. I want to thank all of you wonderful panelists for this great conversation. I want to thank everyone who joined us in the Zoom call or on Facebook. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Ciara, who is in the background, who is our stage manager, taking care of us invisibly. If you're interested in participating in climate change theater action, you can go to our website. It lists how to get in touch with us and get access to the plays. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in a series of 6 conversations. Our next one is on April 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be a CCTA meetup. Well, we'll invite people who have participated before and potential participants this year to come together and share tips about what was done before. We'll send you to breakout room. You can talk to each other into smaller groups. I think that's it. Thank you so much. And we will see you again soon.
Thanks.